when we started this unit, I said that this is what the immigration system looked like before 1967. And now I get to talk a little bit about what the immigration system looks like, roughly speaking, after 1967. So in some ways, it's actually pretty similar. So the conversation about what Canada's immigration systems are intended to do is about trying to make decisions. So the number of immigrants that are accepted in any given year is a political one. That's a political decision that is made by sort of MPs, and they have their conversations. They sort of pass bills about that, or ministerial orders, depending. When we start talking about an immigration system, that is a way for the bureaucrats, sort of the institution of the Canadian government, to decide who is coming to Canada to make up that 100,000, 200,000, however many people you want to talk about having immigrate to Canada. And prior to 1967, it was a country list. So, like, you take all of the people from these countries first, and then these countries, and then these countries, and you just sort of go down the list in order until you run out of spots. There's a relatively similar system now in terms of we set a number and then we go down a list. The criteria for who gets placed where on that list have just changed. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is sort of the advent of something called, it's a points system. So the people with the highest score, it works a little bit like university admissions actually. The people with the highest score on this sort of criteria get in first, and we go down the list till we run out of spots, right? It's sort of like an admissions average, okay? And we accord, roughly speaking, this is a system where the maximum score is about 1,200 points, as far as I understand it. And 600 of those are pretty simple. Okay, these are points that you get for that you can get for one of two things. One of those is a qualifying offer of employment. So if you already have an offer to work in a Canadian firm in Canada, that is sort of a good chunk of your points for immigrating to Canada because you already have a job and you want to live in Canada, all that sort of stuff. The other way to get access to those 600 points is to have what is referred to as a provincial nomination. So this is what happens when, for example, a province like Alberta says, hey, we need licensed practical nurses. We need to hire more nurses. We're not training enough. So we would like to have people come work as LPNs. And if you are coming into Canada with the training and sort of certifications to work in that field, you basically get a bonus on your immigration point score. Because if you do that, you're sort of, it's a way for provincial governments to sort of signal this person should, like, we should get more of these people because they will meet an economic need in our community. As I said, it's not that we don't have, in my first video on this unit, it's not that we don't have preferences for immigrants anymore, it's that those preferences tend to be economic in nature, okay? So that's the first 600 points, or the second, depending on how you set it up. The other 600 points are really about things that are about you as an individual. So you get points awarded for age. So the preference is for immigrants to come to Canada after they have completed their education, so after they got their degree, but before sort of middle age. So like immigrating to Canada at like 30 or 25 is awesome. And the reasoning that Canada prefers that to, for example, immigrating to Canada at 50 is that if you immigrate to Canada at 25 and you work for until you're 65, you will have been paying taxes for 40 years by the time Canada has to provide you with the Canada Pension Plan and all of those benefits and that sort of stuff. If you immigrate to Canada at 50, then you will only be paying taxes, for example, for 15 years before that is the case. And the argument, and along with a number of other things, in that for a lot of people, it is harder to sort of break into a new industry in a new country at 50 than it was at 25 because of the way that that sort of system works out. So you also get points in that sort of 600 for having an education. You can get points for having your education, taken your education in Canada. So there's a lot of people who are seeking to immigrate to Canada who wind up doing their degrees here on student visas and then applying to immigrate, because there's a value in having that Canadian education and that Canadian sort of experience here. You can also get points for having completed education outside of Canada, although not all of those qualifications are recognized. So as much as we start talking about like we need LPNs, that doesn't necessarily mean that the government of Alberta is actually allowing people who immigrated with a provincial nomination as licensed practical nurses to practice as licensed practical nurses. That's sort of a different regulatory hurdle that we could get into. You get points for language skills. So when we talk about immigration interviews, you will get interviewed in English and in French and that kind of thing to sort of assume, to see if you have those skills. The idea there is that it will be easier for you to integrate and fit into Canadian society if you already have skills in at least one of Canada's official languages. As I sort of mentioned some time ago, Quebec has some control over its own immigration policy. So French-speaking immigrants are often sort of encouraged to settle in Quebec. Quebec sort of does some incentives for people to do that, partially because it's easier. If you only speak French, it's a little harder to settle, for example, in Edmonton. And Edmonton does have a relatively vibrant Francophone community, but you need to know where it is and you need to be able to access it to be able to sort of live in French that way. It's not going to be easier for you to survive, for example, in Sherbrooke or in Chicoutimi than it is going to be able to sort of live in Fort McMurray because of just the demographics there. We also give, the system also awards points for work experience inside and outside of Canada. So again, because the preference is for immigrants who are going to contribute economically, there is a preference for people who have already proven that they have a degree of work experience, whether that is in or outside of Canada. Again, inside and outside of Canada are calculated a little bit differently, but that's okay. So there's some experience questions there. So that's why I sort of say like 30 is about right, because you finish your degree like mid-20s, if you're sort of doing the traditional, like the straight through path, right? You finish your education like mid-20s, then you work for like 5 years in your country of origin, and then you immigrate. Canada loves you, because that is sort of an easy way for you to do that. You can also get points for having relatives and some kind of social network in Canada. And that is because, again, that makes it easier for you to integrate, easier for you to sort of get connected to a community, and less likely that you're going to need certain kinds of supports that are theoretically available, but are probably better not provided by the government. So this is, for example, that the government doesn't necessarily, like you're not going to be calling Service Canada going, hi, I can't find a grocery store, because you have friends or relatives in Canada who can help you locate that and can help you navigate that system and can do things like ensure that you have tutors for your kids. If your kids are sort of adjusting to school, you can do all of that kind of thing. So there's sort of some family reunification stuff that can be really, really useful. Okay. This is, as I said, like a twist on the old system. You just used to get points for the country that you were coming from, and you don't anymore. So that's sort of this idea about how that points system works. The details I'm not worried about. Like, I'm not ever going to ask you how many points you get for X. What I want you to understand about this is what we are ranking. And when we sort of look at criteria like these, one of the things that you'll find is that, as I sort of mentioned when I talked about brain drain, the Canadian government is looking for people who are already doing really, really well. This is not an immigration policy that is intended to, for example, address economic inequity between the global north and the global south. This is not a policy that is intended to do things like say, so there's these problems of too many people in certain areas of the world, and Canada has a really low population density, so we're going to try to even things out, and we're going to sort of say, okay, if we remove people from the slums in this particular city, then environmental efforts are going to be a little bit easier there, so those people can move to Canada. That's not what we're doing. Canada is saying these are the people who are going to help us, and those are the people we want to have immigrate. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, okay? There's a whole conversation about whether or not we have a duty to accept immigrants like this, and we'll talk a little bit about the refugee question next, which is sort of the place where we do get that sort of duty question. But when we talk about sort of the idea about immigration, I do sort of want you to understand that mostly because the rhetoric and the discussion about how Canada works is often really heavily focused on this idea of Canada being this open and welcoming place, and we sort of welcome the world into our borders. And that's true so long as those people can contribute economically, or the perception is that they're going to do so. That's an important sort of aspect of this kind of conversation. So next up, refugee policy.